Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from RAU'S.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC Civil Services Examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 14th of February 2021. The articles which we are going to cover today are displayed on your screen. Let us now begin the discussion.
So we will begin the discussion with a very important article appearing on page number 1. Incentivise states for disinvestment in PSEs. Now this article deals with an interview taken by the Hindu newspaper of the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, Mr. N.K. Singh. And whatever he says about the state of economy, what government is doing to raise up the resources becomes very important. And so we are going to take up one very important aspect highlighted by Mr. N.K. Singh. That is disinvestment in public sector undertakings or public sector enterprises. Now this topic becomes very important from the perspective of GS paper 3, especially under the portion of Indian economy. As you can see, there is a line in the syllabus which says Indian economy and issues related to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development and employment. Now, whether the government should run public sector undertakings or enterprises or not, and if it should run, what should be the model, is actually a question of mobilization of resources. Because when government decides to disinvest or when the government decides to sell these public sector undertakings, so what government is essentially doing is reallocating the resources and mobilizing the resources so that they become available for other purposes. So in this discussion, what we are going to do is that first we will understand the disinvestment process. Why is there a need to disinvest after all? Then we will understand the 3 phases of disinvestment in India's modern history after post-independence. What are the advantages of disinvestment? Then we'll look into some of the examples where disinvestment has been very fruitful for economy in particular and the country in general. And then finally, none of the issues related to economy are without any demerits. And then we will look into some of the questions which can be raised about the current disinvestment policy being adopted by the government of India. So let us now begin the discussion. So in order to understand the disinvestment, you will first have to go back in time. Go back at the time of the independence, where the government of India adopted a socialist kind of economy. And so because of that, most of the industrial activity in our country was allocated or reserved for public sector, as it was called the commanding heights of the economy. We all know that, right? And so for the first 4 decades after independence, India pursued a path of development in which the public sector was expected to be the engine of India's growth, economic growth. And so it was just a matter of time before it was realized that these public sector undertakings or public sector enterprises or these government companies were proving out to be quite ineffective. There was a drastic decline in the net worth of these companies as well as their net profits. There was very low return on assets and equity, and also the gross revenues of these companies were sharply falling. Apart from these, there were other issues related to corruption, low work ethics, overcapitalization due to substantial time and cost overruns. And so because of these factors, these public sector undertakings became a loss-making firms. They were perpetually in loss. So even if you look at the losses incurred by Air India, there is a massive infusion of cash every year by the government of India just to keep Air India afloat. And this is a big problem because the money fueling these public sector undertakings come from the revenues earned by the government. Government has to allocate these resources to run these companies. And so when came 1991, people started questioning the participation of government in business. Because people started to wonder that if most of the jobs done by public sector undertakings, for example, flying aircrafts, manufacturing watches, production of electricity, when all these things can be easily taken care of by the private sector, why is there a need for the government to involve itself into these businesses and complicate its overall functioning? And so that is where the disinvestment comes into play. Because disinvestment means sale of assets by the government. So if the government controls 100% of a company, let's say a company A, and so there could be a lot of ways in which the government can decide to liquidate its equity. For example, as you can see, there is one method which is called minority disinvestment, through which the government retains a majority stake in the company, typically greater than 51%, thus ensuring the management control over that company. But Rest 49% or less than that is sold to the private sector. Then there is another kind of disinvestment, which is majority disinvestment, where post disinvestment the government retains minority stake in the company. So although the government will have shares of that company, but the government will not have control over the management of the company. And then finally, the privatization or complete disinvestment, wherein the 100% control of the company is passed on to a private sector buyer. And so, as and when the idea of disinvestment crept into India's policy making, three phases of disinvestment can be easily identified. So, after 1991, the first phase of disinvestment was sale of minority stake in bundles through auction, as we have just discussed. Then came the second phase, separate sale of each PSU. And then finally, of late, that is in last 5 to 10 years, we are in the era of privatization, which means either selling of the majority stake and the management control over the company. So you can say that it is basically transfer of ownership and control of a public sector entity to some other private entity. And so that is where the strategic disinvestment comes into play, because of course it comes with a lot of advantages. So one direct advantage which has not been written in the slides is of course that the sale of these massive public sector undertakings is going to earn a lot of revenues for the government. But that is just one time. That is not something which can be perpetuated for a very long time. And so that is why it has not been written, because these advantages of privatization or strategic disinvestment are long lasting ones. And so let us understand them. So first and foremost is that strategic disinvestment has a very long lasting impact on labor productivity and overall efficiency of the company, because it has been observed that post privatization the performance of privatized entity improves significantly in terms of net worth, net profit, return on assets, return on equity, as well as on gross revenues. As we have discussed, this has been a cause of concern as far as these PSUs are concerned, and it has been observed that whenever public sector undertakings are privatized, all these parameters get significantly improved. And because government has sold its loss-making public sector undertaking, the allocation, the capital allocation on behalf of the government improves significantly. Because if government is not doing business, then that means all the energy, attention, as well as the capital resources of the government have been directed towards sectors in which only government can act. For example, law and order, social services, providing to the needs of vulnerable sections, isn't it? And so when government takes its attention away from these business entities, you basically have a scenario where government is doing what only government can do and businesses are doing what only businesses should do. And so that is why it improves the overall efficiency of the economy as well. Then massive participation of private sector in any field has multiplier effect on other sectors. And when the government monopolies end and a lot of private players are allowed to participate in particular field, it leads to competition. Enhanced competition ultimately benefits the consumers. And as we have discussed, the issues of work culture, corruption, and many other factors are addressed because private sector comes with a lot of professionalism. And professionalism in management of any entity is a prerequisite for its success, which is a major demerit with the public sector undertaking. And so when we talk about so many advantages of privatization or strategic disinvestment, do we have any data to substantiate this fact? Yes, of course we have, because if you remember, earlier the telecom sector as well as the airways sector was monopolized by the government. So 20 years ago, no private company could provide telecom services or could fly its aircraft in the air in India. And so later on, these sectors were opened for private sector. What you see in telecom is that there is a significant reduction in tariffs benefiting the consumers. And also, if you look at how the usage of data and adoption of 4G, how rapid it has been, that is only because of high level of participation of private sector. Had it been only in the control of the government, this would not have been possible. Similarly, if you look at airways, there is a drop in fares after the participation of the private sector. At the same time, the quality of the services have improved. Apart from that, there is an increase in the connectivity as far as overall Indian map is concerned. So these are the two case studies you can cite to demonstrate the past success of opening up of a public sector to the private entity. But this idea of privatization on paper looks very, very good. On experience, also, it looks very good. But some of the very valid criticisms have been raised by various political as well as economic thinkers. And let us discuss them. So, first and foremost is that not all public sector companies are loss making. There are a lot of massive profit making public sector undertakings as well. And so, when the government has decided to go for massive privatization, and if the government sells the profit making and dividend paying PSUs to the private sector, this would result in the loss of regular income to the government. Because when the government goes for privatization, it gets massive sums of money, but that is only once. But if a public sector undertaking is making profits year on year, that is a regular income for many decades. And so, at this point of time, the government should not be selling the profit making and dividend paying PSUs. Then there are questions related to strategic and national security concerns. Because the strategic disinvestment of oil PSUs can be seen by some of the experts as a threat to national security, because we all know that oil is a strategic natural resource. And the ownership of these resources in the hands of private sector, in which foreign players could also be involved, could threaten India's energy security and hence could become a strategic and national security concern. And this is just one of the examples. There are other sectors also, if privatized, could lead to these kinds of concern. Then there are concerns related to cronyism. Because when government decides to sell its company to a private player, the ownership is completely transferred. And so it becomes important that the government follows complete transparency in the way this ownership is transferred. And then there are threats of asset stripping. Because we know that these public sector undertakings, apart from their main businesses, have very valuable assets. For example, land in prime locations, investments in plants and machineries, buildings. And so when these PSUs are sold, the government loses control over those assets as well. And so there are a lot of concerns related to that as well. And so the question arises as to what should the government do? So of course the answer lies in the issues. So the government should not immediately sell the profit-making and dividend-paying PSUs. Then some of the sectors should be identified as core sectors or the sectors of national interest, which should never be privatized. Then a very transparent and accountable process should be adopted while selling these assets to the private sector, so that no one can raise questions over the ingenuity of the government to sell these assets. And then finally, a lot of assets held with these public sector undertakings should be identified and a proper decision should be taken whether or not to sell these assets along with the PSUs or not. So this discussion becomes very important from the perspective of GS paper 3, where you could be expected to understand not only the disinvestment process, why is it needed, what are its advantages, and then finally there are some issues as well. Let us now move on to the next discussion. UT status for J&K is temporary, says Amit Shah, appears on page number 7. So Home Minister Mr. Amit Shah has recently told Lok Sabha that the government would restore full statehood to Jammu and Kashmir at an appropriate time, when the situation becomes normal. The Home Minister was replying to a discussion on the Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Amendment Bill 2021 in the Lok Sabha. Now, the formation of states and UTs is a very important matter dealing with the Constitution of India. And as you can see, not just for prelims examination, but also for mains examination under GS paper 2, Indian Constitution historical underpinnings, evolution, features is given right there in the syllabus. Also, functions and responsibilities of the union and the states have also been mentioned. And so in this regard, it becomes very important for us to understand the whole process of formation of new states and alteration of areas, boundaries or names of existing states, because this has already been directly asked in the prelims examination and can also be asked again. And so we are going to understand the part 1 to the Constitution of India, that is the Union and its territories. Starting with the Article 1, which defines the name and the territory of Union. And notice the word Union has been used rather than a federation. So India, that is Bharat. So the name Bharat has been mentioned in the Constitution, shall be a union of states. Now the usage of word union has a very special significance. Let us know in the comment section whether you are aware of the connotations or not. Clause 2 says the states and the territories thereof shall be specified in the first schedule. So as you can see some of the snippets of the first schedule on your screen, and that is how the territory of India is defined by the Constitution. And so what shall comprise the territory of India? territories of the states. So all those territories of states shall form the territory of India. Then it will be combined with the union territories which have been specified in the first schedule, and also such other territories as may be acquired. So constitution has not only taken care of the older territories, but it is cognizant of the fact that India could acquire new territories, and so all of them combined would form the territory of India. Article 2 provides for admission or establishment of new states. So the power has been given to Parliament, which by law admit into the union or establish new states on such terms and conditions as it thinks fit. So Parliament is not bound by the Constitution as far as admission or establishment of new states is concerned. Now here these states are territories which are acquired by our country and not the existing states, because that is dealt with in Article 3, which talks about formation of new states and alteration of areas, boundaries or names of existing states. And so, utilizing the powers given in Article 3 of the Constitution, the state of Jammu and Kashmir was fragmented into two union territories, one union territory of Jammu and Kashmir and union territory of Ladakh. So, Article 3 clearly states that Parliament may by law. So first and foremost, that whatever you have to do with the states, be it alteration of their areas, boundaries or names, there has to be a law which has to be passed from the Parliament. And what Parliament can do by passing a law? It can form a new state by separation of territory from any state, or by uniting two or more states or parts of states, or by uniting any territory to a part of any state, increase the area of any state, diminish the area of any state, alter the boundaries of any state, and alter the name of any state. Now, when you look at this particular article so far, an important question is that everywhere the term state has been used. Nowhere it talks about how to change the name of union territories and how to bifurcate or combine two union territories. And the reason for that is given in explanation 1, because it says in this article, in clauses A to E, that is clause A, B, C, D and E, states includes a union territory. So whatever process has been mentioned for the states is also applicable for union territory. But there is a condition. And this long paragraph basically says that bill to be introduced for reorganization of states has to be recommended by the president. So while most bills can be tabled in Parliament without any recommendation for President, for tweaking with any kind of attributes related to states, whether it is name, area, boundaries, recommendation of President is a must. But explanation 1 also says that in the proviso, which means that this portion, state does not include a union territory. And so, which means that if the President has to tweak the area of a union territory, recommendation of President is not must. So recommendation of President is required only to alter or tweak with states and not with union territories. That is one important takeaway. The second important takeaway from this long paragraph is that where proposals contained in the bill affect the areas, boundaries or names of any of the states, the bill must be referred by the President to the legislature of that state for expressing its views within a prescribed time frame. So for example, there are two states A and B, and so what the Parliament does is that takes out chunks of areas from both and forms a third state. Now what Constitution mandates is that such a bill should first be sent to both these legislative assemblies. Now here an important term is expressing its views, which means that if the bill is sent to the state legislature and if that is passed or failed, it doesn't matter. President just has to take a view within a given time frame, but Parliament is not bound by such views. So if the legislative assemblies reject the idea of separation of a state, let's say, the Parliament is not bound by such expression of views. It is not mandatory or obligatory on it to consider such views expressed by the legislative assembly. So you can easily understand that when the state of Jammu and Kashmir was converted into union territory, the powers given in Article 3 was utilized. Now, an important question arises that when you are going to bifurcate a state or you're going to combine two states, obviously Schedule 1 is going to change. And so would that mean that it would be considered as an amendment to the Constitution? And so that is why Article 4 has been made by our Constitution makers, which says laws made under Article 2 and 3 to provide for amendment of the first and fourth schedule and supplemental, incidental, and consequential matters. No such law shall be deemed to be an amendment to this constitution for the purposes of Article 368. So, constitution has clearly stated in Article 4 that whenever you are going to amend Schedule 1 by utilizing the powers given in Article 3, you don't have to follow the procedures and you are not bound by the procedures specified in Article 368, which is the procedure to amend the constitution. So this discussion is very, very pertinent from the perspective of prelims examination. The recommendation of president and mandatorily sending them to legislatures, you should must keep these points in mind. Let us now move on to the next discussion. This next article, The Heights of Constant Friction, appears on page number 13. And in this particular article, the author mainly highlights the significance of control over the Pangong Tso Lake. And it also talks about the LAC or line of actual control. Now, as far as UPSC examination is concerned, it is very, very important to have a clear-cut distinction about India's borders, mainly with respect to a differentiation between LOC and LAC. So first we are going to understand that, and then we are going to look at the strategic significance of Pangong Tso Lake. So now it becomes important for us to understand the differentiation between all of them. Then only we will be able to grasp India's border management in a better way. And this article obviously helps us in those clarifications. Now, the map of the country which you see here has deliberately been plotted with dotted lines because we will first understand the boundary and try to locate them there, and then we will solidify them. So let us start with international border. Now, international border, as the name suggests, is a border which has been accepted by both the countries as well as rest of the global community. So there is no doubt in anyone's mind that which territory belongs to which capital. For example, Ratcliffe Line that divided British India into India and Pakistan. So if you try to plot a Ratcliffe Line, it looks something like this. Basically, border between India and Pakistan at the time of partition. Of course, later on when Pakistan was fragmented into two parts, the current border which India shares with Bangladesh is also international border. Now, if we talk about India's international border with Pakistan, it starts in Gujarat and ends at Akhnur in Jammu. Now, since it is a mutually accepted borders as far as both countries are concerned, this border has normal mechanisms which the two peaceful borders and countries would place. For example, these borders are not guarded by army generally. They are guarded by border security forces from Indian side. It also has usual phenomena like land customs stations and immigration checkposts to allow entry and exit of passengers as well as cargo. Of course, since last 2 to 3 years, all these activities have been suspended, but nonetheless, under usual circumstances, this is the norm. Now, there are two more components to the border between India and Pakistan, and that is line of control and actual ground position line. I hope that you might be aware that just after partition, India and Pakistan entered into a bitter war in Jammu and Kashmir. And later on, they entered into a truce and subsequently a ceasefire line which came into existence after 1947 and 48 Indo-Pak War was later on recognized as line of control. So basically what it means that just after the partition, a lot of region of state of Jammu and Kashmir was captured by Pakistan. Although Indian army pushed the Pakistani guerrillas up to a large extent, but before that ceasefire was called in. The ceasefire line was decided to be the actual position which both the armies were holding then, and hence this is what came to be known as line of actual control. So if we zoom it in, we'll see that line of actual control looks something like this. And this region beyond line of control is known as Pak occupied Kashmir. Now there are two things which are important which you should keep in mind, that line of control is a specific term used with reference to India and Pakistan only. It cannot be used for India and China. It is a ceasefire line which was later on accepted by both the armies because they signed on the agreement in Shimla Agreement, and this line is delineated on map. Now why I'm saying it is important is because it will come handy when we compare the line of control with that of line of actual control. But delineation on map and having been signed by both the armies does not mean it is not disputed. It is still disputed, but both countries decided to maintain status quo until there is a peaceful resolution of the dispute of Jammu and Kashmir.
Now, next key term is actual ground position line. Now, it divides the current position of Indian and Pakistani troops in the Siachen region. It extends from northernmost point of LOC, which is NJ 9842, and ends at Indra Kol in the north. Now, if we try to understand this on the map, there is a point at which the line of control ends, beyond which it was not delineated. So, this northernmost point is NJ 9842. And somewhere around here is Indira Kol. And a straight line connecting these 2 points is actual ground position line. On western side sits Pakistan, and on the eastern side we have Siachen Glacier, which is totally controlled by our country. So if we talk about borders of India with that of Pakistan and China, these three terms are used with reference to Pakistan boundary, whereas the term line of actual control is used with respect to India-Chinese boundaries. Now, as we discussed, that line of control between India and Pakistan is delineated on a map and signed by armies of both countries. But in this case, the first thing you should notice is line of actual control between India and China remains ambiguous. If we talk about its segregation, it is divided into three sectors. The eastern sector, which spans Arunachal Pradesh and Sikkim, the middle sector in Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh, and the western sector, of course, in Ladakh. However, the line of actual control in the region of Ladakh does not converse with the political map of our country. It runs something like this, with Aksai Chin controlled by China. So as you can see, it has never been put on a map, and that leads to frequent intrusions by Chinese into Indian territories because of the differing opinions of where the actual line is. But as the time passed, the intrusions in each other's territories increased in Ladakh region. Finally, in 1993, it was felt that a time has come to put an end to this differing perception of the line of actual control because it could ultimately lead to war. And hence, both the countries signed the agreement to maintain peace and tranquility at line of actual control in 1993, and India formally accepted the line of actual control. So from the perspective of prelims examination, it becomes important to know the differentiation between international border, line of control, actual ground position line, and line of actual control. Also, this differentiation is important to understand the current context in which India and China are involved at various locations in Ladakh.
And now let us understand why this article lays so much of emphasis on Chushul Valley and Pangong So Lake. So starting with the name, the article says Pangong in Ladakhi language means extensive concavity and so means lake in Tibetan. So a concave lake. As far as the characteristic of this lake is concerned, it is a glacial melt, has mountain spurs which are referred to as fingers, and the possession and the control over these finger areas that one of the troubles was caused during India-China face-off in Ladakh region. So India has always held till finger 4 while it claims till finger 8, which is where the Indian perception of the line of actual control lies. Whereas the Indian army sends patrols from finger 3 to finger 8 on foot, while the Chinese have built a road for their vehicular movement. Both sides also patrol the water on speedboats, which also results in frequent face-offs. However, the face-offs are usually resolved as per the protocols agreed to for maintaining peace and tranquility on border. Now, the south bank of Pangong So Lake leads to Kailash Range and to Chushul Valley, or the Chushul sector. And Chushul sector is critical as it lends room for tank maneuver owing to its flat terrain. And this was also the site of the battle during 1962 war. And so over the years, India has strengthened its defenses on the south bank in addition to deployment of tanks. For India, Pangong is critical to maintain hold on the Chushul Valley. We lose control over the Pangong So Lake, and in no time Chinese would enter into the Chushul Valley area, coming very close to the mainland India. Then this next article, probing the origins of COVID-19 pandemic, appears on page number 12, that is FAQ page. Now, after several months of delay, concerns over access and bickering between China and US, a 17-member team from the World Health Organization began a field visit on 29th of January 2021. And the reason was to unearth or to find out the origin of SARS-CoV-2 virus that has so far spread to over 108 million people and has killed nearly 24 lakh people across the globe since last year. According to WHO, the field visits included the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the Wuhan Market, and the Wuhan Center for Disease Control and Prevention Laboratory. Now, according to WHO, the visits were limited in nature because they were organized by Chinese officials and they were not able to establish contacts with community members. An important question arises as to why is this such a baffling issue and why is it important to find out the origins of SARS-CoV-2. Now for that, you have to go into basics. You have to understand that most of the virus, just like many other pathogens, are host specific. For instance, take the example of HIV virus or human immunodeficiency virus. Now this virus is very specifically designed to infect only humans, and let's say if a syringe being infected with HIV is administered to any of the animals, it is not going to infect them simply because it will fail to bind with the receptors of animal cells because it has evolved in such a way to infect only humans. Now since SARS-CoV-2 or novel coronavirus is a new virus which was not found in human species before 2019, the obvious question arises, how was it able to infect humans? How was it able to reach to the human species? And so there are three ways or three theories which have been proposed in order to understand the origin of the coronavirus. So since we are confirmed that this kind of virus did not exist in humans, it must have come from some species which is yet not confirmed. But earlier instances of SARS and MERS have been confirmed to have come from bats. And so there are high chances that this coronavirus or novel coronavirus has also emerged from bats. Now, we have already seen that how these viruses are host specific. And so if a virus is infecting bats, it needs to change its genetic material. It needs to evolve before it can infect humans. And there are three ways in which it can be done. First is, of course, the one which has been plotted in the black line over here, that the virus crossed the species barrier, which means the barrier imposed due to genetics. It crossed the species barrier from bats to humans through an intermediary species. Now this role of intermediary host gains currency as previous coronavirus outbreaks, SARS in 2002 and 3, MERS in 2012, have occurred through civet cats and camels. So when earlier spreads of coronavirus, the virus reached to humans through intermediary species, there are high chances that even in this case there was some intermediary species, there the virus evolved and gained the capability to infect humans. But nothing has been confirmed so far. The second theory is that the virus crossed the species barrier directly from bats to humans, and there was no intermediary species. Now, the direct spillover of the virus from the bats to humans is unlikely as the Wuhan is miles away from any natural bat habitat. And so, when humans generally do not come in contact with wild bats, it is highly unlikely that this barrier was crossed without any intermediary species. And so, that is what is plotted in the red line. And the third theory is, of course, virus leaked from Wuhan Institute of Virology, which has been studying coronaviruses since a long time. And so when they were studying, they tweaked with the genetic material. And so instead of evolving in natural environment, the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, mutated in a controlled environment from where it got leaked and it gained the capability to infect humans. Now, so this visit of WHO officials to China have not concluded or confirmed any of these theories simply because they were not allowed access, and so wherever they visited and whatever they took as evidences have been guided by the Chinese officials. For a very long time to come, it is going to continue as an enigma. So this next news, Nanophotonics, Hyderabad scientists manipulate tiny crystals, appears on page number 11, which is Science and Technology page on Sundays. And so researchers from University of Hyderabad have done some research which shows how crystals can be sliced and even bent using atomic force microscopy. And so the results of this particular study is going to be very, very helpful in the field of nanophotonics. And so it becomes a very, very important topic for UPSC examination, because if you look at the questions which have been asked in past 3 to 4 years, they have mainly been concentrated on evolving or novel technologies. For example, this question in 2018, 3D printing has applications in which of the following? So the focus was not on how 3D printing works, but the focus was on what are the uses of this particular technology. Then in 2019, UPSC asked RNA interference or RNAi technology has gained popularity in the last few years. Why? And there also, if you analyze the options, all the options deal with the uses of technology. So one inference which can be drawn from previous year questions is that the application of technology is very, very important. And so what we are going to do is that very briefly understand the nanophotonics, and then we are going to understand the application of this emerging field. So nanophotonics or nano-optics is the study of behavior of light on the nanometer scale, as the name obviously suggests. The interaction of nanometer scale objects with light. So basically it is all about light interacting with very, very small particles. And so it is a branch of optics, optical engineering, electrical engineering and nanotechnology. And so when we talk about nanoscale as far as a spectrum of electromagnetic waves is concerned, it usually refers to situations involving ultraviolet, visible and near infrared light, because after that the wavelength increases and it no more remains in the nano scale. Now, one of the problems with the normal optical components like lenses and microscopes is that they generally cannot focus light to nanometer scales, because there is a phenomena known by the name of diffraction which prevents such an interaction. But now it has become possible to squeeze light into nanometer scale using techniques like surface plasmons, localized surface plasmons around nanoscale metal objects, and the nanoscale apertures and nanoscale sharp tips used in near field scanning optical microscopy or SNOM or NSOM. So these are the terms which are not very, very relevant. The question arises that why are we doing nanophotonics? What are the ways in which this particular technology can prove to be useful for human beings? And so let us understand that. First is of course an application in optoelectronics and microelectronics. Now you see, if light can be squeezed into a small volume, it can be absorbed and detected by small detectors. Now the question arises, why do we need small detectors? Now, small detectors have a lot of desirable properties because they have a very low noise, high speed, and low voltage and power. We want smaller detectors to be applied in various uses. But for that, we need nanophotonics. We need light to interact at such a small level, which is not possible right now. Then, there is an application in the solar cell as well, because solar cells often work best when the light is absorbed very close to the surface, both because electrons near the surface have better chances of being collected and because the device can be made thinner, which reduces the cost of the overall cell. And so a lot of researches are going on variety of nanophotonic techniques to intensify light in optimal locations within a solar cell. Then it can be used in spectroscopy as well. Because if a given amount of light energy is squeezed into a smaller and smaller volume, which can be categorized as hot spots, the intensity in the hot spot gets larger and larger. And so this is going to be especially helpful in optics. And one of the applications is in Raman scattering. It allows sensitive spectroscopy measurements of even single molecules located in the hot spot, unlike traditional spectroscopy methods which take an average over millions or billions of molecules. So now you can see that application of nanophotonics can enhance the level of detection in Raman scattering or Raman spectroscopy as well. Then it has applications in microscopy, because one of the goals of nanophotonics is to construct a so-called superlens, which would use metamaterials or other techniques to create images that are more accurate than the diffraction limit of the light. Now, as far as civil services examination is concerned, these concepts are not easy to understand, but what can be easily remembered is the application of nanophotonics in optoelectronics and microelectronics, solar cells, spectroscopy and microscopy. If you remember these four key terms, you can easily arrive at the right answer. Steps to demolish resort begins, appears on page number 6. Now, authorities have initiated preliminary steps to demolish the illegally constructed villas of Kapiko Kerala Resorts Private Limited on an island in Vembanad Lake. Now, Vembanad Lake is a very important lake from the perspective of UPSC Civil Services examination, because not only it is a Ramsar site, but also it is one of the largest brackish water lakes in our country. And particularly the Ramsar wetlands are very important from the perspective of UPSC examination. For example, in 2018, UPSC asked which of the following is an artificial lake. And out of the four options which UPSC provided, two, Koleru Lake and Renuka Lake, were Ramsar wetlands, whereas Kodaikanal and Nainital were not. And similarly, in other years also, the questions have been framed on various lakes and water bodies which are Ramsar sites. And so it becomes very important for us to understand few basic facts about Vembanad Lake. Now, as far as this question is concerned, the right answer was Kodaikanal Lake, also known as Kodai Lake, is a man-made lake located in Kodaikanal city, which is in Tamil Nadu. So as you can see on the screen, Vembanad Lake is a very large lake. It has a brackish water and it is characterized by humid tropical wetland ecosystem, and it lies on the southwest coast of India. And the main source of freshwater river in the Vembanad Lake are rivers, and so it is fed by 10 rivers. And overall ecosystem is that of estuarine in nature. Now, estuaries are water bodies that are usually found where rivers meet the sea. And so they are a partially enclosed coastal body of brackish water with one or more rivers or streams flowing into it. And it is famous for its clams, and it supports the third largest waterfowl population in India during winter months. And so it supports a lot of biodiversity as well. Over 90 species of resident birds and 50 species of migratory birds are found in the coal area. Now, if we talk about the significance of Vembanad Lake in its local and regional area, it provides protection from flood for thickly populated coastal areas of 3 districts of Kerala. It helps in the recharge of the groundwater to supply well water for the region. And it also acts as a key element of local transport, which has a quite considerable share coming from Vembanad Lake waters. Now, if we talk about geographic map locations, the lake is bordered by Alapuzha or Alapi, Kottayam and Ernakulam districts. It is situated at sea level and it is separated from Lakshadweep Sea by a narrow barrier island. Canals link the lake to other coastal lakes in the north and south. Now let us consider for what Vembanad Lake is famous for. Now, if you have seen the visual images of boat race in Kerala, the most famous one, Nehru boat race, is conducted in a portion of the lake. The Government of India has identified the Vembanad wetland under the National Wetland Conservation Program. It is the wetland of international importance as defined by Ramsar Convention. And Kumarkom Bird Sanctuary lies on the east coast of the lake. As far as major threats are concerned, plastic pollution is the major threat to the lake ecosystem and to the entire biodiversity.